Hi everyone, my name's Steve Sheen. Delighted to welcome you to our autumn learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you've told us that of an interest to you. Today's event is about enabling council's social and affordable housing ambitions, which is really topical at the moment. While these sessions are designed for local government, we are pleased to also welcome other relevant partners working in housing, placemaking and regeneration. Next slide. So the Autumn Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre. Slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are, so I don't intend to go through that, but so just if you can just see that for yourselves. Next slide, please. So this is the learning programme is just one of the tools offered by the Local Government Capacity Centre. Our offer also includes the Housing Information Hub and a capacity analysis tool, which you can use to assess capacity. If you get a chance, have a look through once we send the slides out after this session, because there's some really, really good information on there that you could use in your day-to-day work. There's loads and loads of links to information around viability, financial viability, and various other things. So on the agenda, we're going to sort of kick off in a minute with the first of three presentations. Got three really good presentations today from Anna Collins at Arup, and then we're going to move on to enabling the delivery of affordable housing, Project 500, which is a Manchester-based project. So Reggie and Jess from Manchester and Natalie from Jigsaw are going to sort of cover that one. And then we're going to go on to partnering with local authorities, impact first social housing, conversions and small sites. So Richard Kennedy from Cornerstone Place is going to be covering that one. So I'm now going to hand you over to our first presenter, Anna Collins.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Collins. I'm a senior consultant at Arup, and many of you may know Arup from an engineering point of view. But just to note, we are also a global collective of planners, designers, consultants, engineers, and experts designated to sustainable development. So we have around 19,000 staff worldwide, covering 120 technical disciplines, and we have almost 6,000 staff across England. So I just wanted to start really by giving an overview of why we need more homes and crucially more affordable homes, which isn't just a UK problem, it's also a global problem. So starting with undersupply, we know that the UK is experiencing a chronic housing shortage, and statistics quoted on the housing backlog vary from around 2.5 to 4 million homes in England. And as I'm sure you're all aware, house prices and rental prices are also rising, with greater demand and undersupply being a key contributing factor. I've also got population growth and household growth on here, as increasing demand is coming from kind of both these sides, as is increasing life expectancies. And all of these factors also ultimately have knock-on consequences, which I've outlined on the bottom of the slide here. So starting with affordability, one of the statistics from the ONS indicate that in 1997, 89% of local authorities had an affordability ratio, of less than 5 times workers' earnings, whereas in 2022, this was only 7% of local authorities. Also, people are living in substandard and unsuitable homes. So in 2022 to 23, there were 3.5 million households, which is around 14% in England, living in a home that failed to meet the decent home standard. And just finally there, so whilst causes of homelessness are multifaceted, we know that people are becoming homeless because they can't find a suitable and affordable home. And relatedly, we're facing a temporary accommodation crisis. So today, whilst we'll be thinking about affordable housing in its broadest context, increasing the availability of social homes is seen as a crucial step in reducing the reliance on temporary accommodation. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So given that the topic of this learning programme is about enabling council social and affordable housing ambitions, I thought it was important just to acknowledge that local authorities are not all facing the same challenges, and that's due to differences in the factors that are shown here on screen. And I'll just give a brief overview of these now. So starting with land availability, we know there are regional variations in the availability of land, and I'm sure there's local authorities from across England on the call today. Obviously, we know that land values vary across the country as well, with regions of London, South East and also the South West generally having those higher land values on average. We also know that local authorities differ in terms of their land holdings, and that's both in terms of overall land area, but also the size of plots that are in ownership or control. Resourcing also differs between local authorities, so in terms of both human resources, but also financial resources, which includes access to funding and borrowing. Of course, with not all councils having the same ability to borrow. Also, indirect and direct delivery. So we know that local authorities do vary in terms of their involvement in direct delivery, but there's some research by UCL which suggests that this is on the rise. Spending on temporary accommodation, as I touched on earlier, this is a significant issue, and council spent around 1.7 billion on TA for homeless households between April 22 and March 23. But of course, that spend differs between authorities for various reasons. And finally, we know that partnerships play a crucial role in delivering affordable housing, but we know that local authorities differ in both the type and extent of their partnerships. For example, with RPs, developers, and also other organisations, and that's something we'll be exploring in further detail today. It's also just worth noting, sorry if we could just flip back just the very end of that last slide, just worth noting that depending on the needs and within a place, we know that there are challenges posed by different types of affordable housing. So today we won't just be exploring general needs, but we will share some examples of specialist and supported housing. And it's also worth saying that it's not just about the challenges that local authorities are facing. For example, we know that RPs are generally having to spend more money on repairs and maintenance, responding to new legislation, and so on. And all of that has implications on the resources available to support new development. If you move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just moving on now to the report that ARIP supported on affordable housing. So last year we were commissioned by Homes England and Sheffield City Council to do some research, and that was into how local authorities were delivering affordable housing, looking at some best practice and providing some recommendations to Sheffield on what other approaches they could consider to address their affordable housing challenges. So just as shown here, we kind of started with a desktop review of case study examples. And it's worth noting, and I guess it's fair to say there are many reports out there which outline different approaches, but our real focus was on those examples which we thought would be of most relevance to Sheffield. So we reached out to those local authorities responsible for deploying the approaches that were most of interest to us. And of those contacted to participate, we interviewed 5 local authorities, as well as the National Housing Federation. And as some authorities were deploying multiple models, our discussions ended up covering the 7 models, which are on the right-hand side of the screen right now. So the purpose of the session today isn't to go into these models in detail, but some of the examples later in the presentation will touch on most of these. But just to summarise those on the right-hand side, so direct delivery, partnerships with RPs, which I'll go into more detail today, as will others. Corporate joint venture, which is where a new development company is established, councils establishing their own housing company, partnerships with community-led housing, which comprises a few different models within itself, empty homes, which is enabling reuse of existing stock, and income strip and leaseback models. So it's probably just worth noting as well that this list of models on the right-hand side isn't intended to be exhaustive, and there is also some crossover between options and also sub-options within these. If we could move on to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So what did we find and recommend? So as we expected, we found that there was not one silver bullet in unlocking affordable housing delivery, but the councils we interviewed were often benefiting from a multifaceted approach. So that involved direct delivery by the council, the private sector, and working with RPs. In Sheffield, specifically, deepening partnerships with RPs was identified as playing a primary role in delivering more affordable housing, although this primary recommendation was in response to Sheffield's specific context, including their land holdings. Although whilst our report, it was focused on recommendations for Sheffield, but we do still think there is wider applicability, and that's both with respect to deepening partnerships with registered providers, which I'll come on to now, but also some of the broader lessons learned regardless of the approach, and that's what I'll summarise at the end. We can move on, please. Thank you. So as I just mentioned, deepening partnerships with RPs was identified as playing a primary role for Sheffield in accelerating their affordable housing delivery. And whilst we recognise that the council were already engaging with registered providers through a loose partnership, we recommended different ways to further this relationship, and the authorities that we interviewed had different approaches to this. So, for example, one of the authorities we interviewed adopted a more formal framework approach, whereby the council established an RP framework. So the council went out to procurement to identify which RPs would form part of that partnership, and this authority now uses this framework to dispose of land to registered providers. And some of the other authorities we spoke to relied on more informal networks. So regardless of the formal framework versus informal network approach, one of the common themes really that came up in the interviews was the value in continuous communication between local authorities, registered providers, and also other partners. So, for example, Bury have partnership meetings with registered providers, and that's enabled partners to share their pipeline of opportunities. There's also examples of local authorities using these forums to undertake soft market testing and therefore kind of helping to shape some of their proposals. And beyond development, some of these authorities that we spoke to were using these forums to resolve operational issues. So, for example, maintenance, antisocial behaviour, or other community challenges in relation to RP managed stock. Another recommendation was putting key account managers in place, and that was to manage communication with the most active RPs, and that included smaller organisations delivering specialist provision. And we found this to be important in ensuring that consistency in contacts and also streamlined communication. So with these examples in mind, we recommended that Sheffield establish a similar network, and Sheffield have now developed a subgroup through the Sheffield Housing Board, through which all parties involved in affordable housing delivery in Sheffield attend a meeting to share data, information on their pipeline, funding, and so on. And attendees at the meeting include Homes England, the Combined Authority, the Council, and RPs. Sheffield have also worked closely with RPs to understand each other's needs, which has enabled a real appreciation of each other's objectives and also their constraints. So the council have been doing quite a lot of soft market testing to ensure that the affordable homes built are in the right places and are meeting the needs of Sheffield's communities. If we could just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just going to touch now on land disposal from local authorities to registered providers, which was an area that we explored in the study. So on the previous slide, I only touched on two brief examples of formal and informal networks with RPs, but the interviews with local authorities identified a range of different options available when councils are seeking to dispose of land to third parties to unlock affordable housing delivery. So some of the key messages from that engagement were, firstly, procurement operates on a spectrum, and unlocking land in partnership doesn't necessarily have to mean a long and protracted process. One of the key examples that will be discussed today is Manchester City Council's example of offering affordable housing development opportunities directly to RP partners rather than going to the wider market, and this is via the Manchester Housing Providers Partnership. Other messages from our engagement were that there can be exceptional cases that negates the need for procurement, for example, where a piece of land has been identified for housing and an RP is the adjacent landowner. And there does, of course, need to be regard to best consideration. And we will refer to best consideration throughout some of the examples today, but the purpose of the session isn't to go in depth on this topic. It's not something that I advise on personally, but I understand Homes England are considering potentially running a future session on this. So with that in mind, I think we're now going to launch our first couple of polls. So there should now be a link pop up or in the chat to participate with this. So just while everyone finds that, so the first question is, if you are representing a local authority who has disposed of land or are disposing of land, have you ever undertaken a restricted or targeted disposal to RP partners? And the second poll is to pick up on the point I raised earlier, which is, would a follow-up learning session on best consideration be of value? So I'm just going to give me a second. I'll see whether some of the results have started to come through. Okay, so we've got a bit of a split in terms of the response to the first question. It's a bit of a mix there. And then in terms of would a follow-up session be of value, most people are saying yes or maybe, which is good news. Thank you. So I just wanted to finish now just on some of the fundamental overarching principles that we identified from our case study interviews. So this slide really just summarises the key things that we found to be important in aiding affordable housing delivery, and that's regardless of the approach deployed. So firstly, an overarching plan identifying what the affordable housing needs are and what is needed in each location. So that's a plan setting out I guess a plan that sets this out is really important in providing that internal direction to officers and communicating council ambitions and needs to external partners. It can also provide an important evidence base for decision making, for example, if disposing at less than best value, as I just mentioned. The second one here is robust and transparent governance structures, and that's both in place at a strategic and an operational level. So Manchester's Strategic Asset Management Board was a good example here. So that's a panel of senior officers across the council, which takes a strategic view of the council's land holdings and determines the best use of the land, which provides that direction to officers. Manchester City Council also has a strategic asset management plan, which sets out the key priorities for the council's property and land asset base, which is overseen by the SAMP board. Third here, we've got consideration of integrated teams, which came up quite a lot during the interviews. So that was in recognition of the fact that meeting affordable housing needs really requires integration with other areas of the council. So, for example, again, Bury, a project group's been developed with representatives from housing and social care, which involves assessing housing needs for those with learning disabilities, mental illness, those in need of old persons accommodation, as well as involving children's services, for example, in relation to the needs of care leavers. The value of dedicated resources also came up. So notwithstanding the challenges of having this resource available, but as I mentioned earlier, using dedicated account managers to deal with specific registered providers has been successful in different local authorities, and also the value of having dedicated planning resources to help fast track some of the applications also came up. And Regina will discuss how this has been working on Project 500 in Manchester in a moment. And then finally here, the value of collaboration and partnerships. So this has been a key thread through our previous slides, but you'll see from the other speakers that we'll also touch on this throughout today. So that's everything from me. So thank you for listening. And I'm now going to hand you over to Regina, Jess and Natalie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Regina Carnham. I'm here at Manchester City Council. I work within the Strategic Housing team as an Affordable Housing Programme Manager.
And I'm Jess Bagley. I'm a Project Officer in Strategic Housing at Manchester City Council.
Okay, so I'll just double check you're at the right session. So the purpose of today really is to take you through our journey today on how we've approached infill sites as part of our overarching approach to placemaking in Manchester, and hopefully share some good practice with local authorities and RP partners who may be in the audience today. So I'd like to start really by providing some wider context on how this project contributes to the overall plan to increase the supply of affordable housing in Manchester. I think Anna's introduction was fantastic, just really to set the scene in terms of the challenges we're facing and how partnerships are really critical to overcoming them. So Project 500 is part of a range of interventions the City Council here at Manchester is undertaking to deliver the ambition set out in our housing strategy. So there's a nice image of that on the right-hand side. And our housing strategy was launched in 2022. It's a 10-year strategy period. And the aim is really to deliver 10,000 low-carbon affordable homes during this period, contributing to the overall 36,000 new homes target. So we have got some big numbers there, and the slide in front of you details the 4 key objectives. So since its launch, we've achieved completion on nearly 1,250 affordable homes, of which 600 have been in the last 12 months. And for us, that's a bit of a record, and we're really proud of that. And Further to that, we actually have 3,250 homes currently under construction or with planning approval. So those figures combined equates to 45% of the 10,000 target. And in terms of tenure, social rent and Manchester living rent, which is our version of affordable rent, which is capped at local housing allowance, is set to make up 62% of all affordable homes delivered by 2032. So, yeah, it all sounds quite impressive, doesn't it? But despite this, there are currently 17,000 live applications on our housing register, and of those, approximately 11,000 are in priority bands 1 to 3. So, you know, they have priority need for larger family homes, for 1 and 2 bed apartments that offer right sizing opportunities. And that's in addition to the, you know, the 100 households or so we have that require a wheelchair accessible home. So yeah, some very serious challenges for us there. However, Project 500 is a strategic fit to meet the high levels of demand for affordable housing in the city. And I suppose one of the key elements of the project is by focusing on our land ownerships on brownfield sites which are nearby to existing infrastructure and transport links, we can really bring this forward. So I'm now going to hand you over to Jess, who will just share some of the key objectives of our project.
So Project 500 set out to deliver 500 affordable homes on small 25 units or less, undesirable infill sites owned by Manchester City Council. And these were brownfield sites that were not market facing or attractive on an individual basis. They were causing a blight to the neighbourhood through antisocial behaviour and fly tipping, and the City Council was incurring ongoing maintenance and management costs on these sites. Through partnership working with the Manchester Housing Providers Partnership, MHPP, which is currently made up of 17 registered housing providers, there was a willingness to explore the concept further and to drive scales of economy and efficiencies across multiple sites, which assisted with viability and streamlined the legal, planning and land disposal element of the process. Through this collaboration, Manchester City Council and MHPP agreed on the following objectives and principles. So to deliver 100% affordable housing on brownfield sites, to address viability and deliverability issues through the portfolio approach, to dispose of multiple publicly owned sites at the same time to improve efficiencies around the associated work for the council and RPs, to develop a standardised legal suite of documents to enable the disposal process, and to continue to work with MHPP driving innovation. The planning and delivery stage has been continuously supported by our quarterly programme board meetings, which allow any problems to be highlighted and worked on collaboratively, and for successes and lessons learned to be shared between ourselves and all of our partners. Regina is now going to talk about the approach to delivery.
So yeah, I hope you've got your pens ready. There's a lot of information to take in, and hopefully I don't sound too robotic delivering some of this. Just want to make sure it's accurate. So I do have some notes I'm referring to. So this slide really tries to capture the key stages of delivery for us on this infill sites programme and working in partnership with a number of RPs. So we set off by identifying 22 sites that would form part of phase 1 of the project, and the sites met the criteria that Jess just explained earlier. The sites were also included in the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, known as SHLA, and in many instances they were raised by our colleagues in neighbourhoods, local councillors as being problematic in terms of ASB, fly tipping, lots of different issues locally. So we approached the matter with our MHPP trusted partners, and 7 of those partners opted into the opportunity to see what was in scope and what was the art of the possible, recognising the challenges ahead but agreeing to work together. So we reviewed the sites, and the group collectively agreed the clustering of the sites focusing really on zones where they already had stock or they wanted to expand. So this approach, did help with future management requirements, but also maximised efficiencies when procuring building services to build new homes on nearby sites. So that was the main way we approached the sites and how they were allocated. And for phase 2, we're doing it slightly differently. We're looking for one registered housing provider partner because it's a smaller portfolio of sites, and we have some, we have everything ready to go on that. So yeah, there's been a lot of lessons learned. So just on the legals, I think this is the key to this particular project. The standardisation of the legal documentation was, the key element and the driving factor of the project. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to give a shout out to my colleagues in the legal team, if they're here today, and to Highlands, who represented the 7 RPs in negotiating those suite of documents. I won't lie, it took a long time. It took nearly 2 years, and we were hit by COVID as well in the middle of it. So our priorities were re-evaluated for a short period. But the process involved MHPP jointly commissioning one solicitor to negotiate the standardised legal documents, and those documents included the contracts, the TP1 land registry, so that's a transfer of registered titles, and the option agreement. And once we were at a stage of the documents being agreed, following an overarching heads of terms being developed, it was agreed that only minor site-specific amendments would be considered by both sides, rather than any significant changes to that suite of documents. And we've applied that documentation to pretty much 20 odd sites now, and that seems to be working very effectively once it gets to that stage. So although this element of the process was quite lengthy for a variety of reasons, it really will allow us now to progress with future infill sites in a future phase of Project 500 at greater speed than phase 1. So I'm just going to move on to the third element, which is governance and funding. So as the audience will be aware, registered housing providers and local authorities broadly have similar governance arrangements in place around board approvals, cabinet approvals, executive approvals. You'll all be familiar with that. And when it comes to the disposal of land, it's a similar story. It's legislated through the Local Government Act 1972, Section 123, and there's a general requirement for us all to achieve best value reasonably obtainable. So in that manner, we carried out appraisals on these very constrained, challenging, complex sites, based on residual land values against the proposed scheme for each site. So I'll put my hands up. I'm not a surveyor, but don't ask me any technical questions about that. But the valuation was in that manner for phase 1. And we also carried out a benchmarking exercise against the build costs and the values to add a level of comparable data to assess those values. And I suppose we've refined the process now for phase 2. Anna very kindly mentioned the strategic asset management plan board, which has been introduced to look at all land holdings within the city council and understand the competing uses and how best to allocate that land supply. As part of that process, my wonderful colleagues in development produce an indicative land value depending on whether the sites are marketed for the open market or affordable homes. And this is overseen by senior officers and the relevant executive members. So for Project 500 Phase 2, we've actually commissioned an independent value on opinion from Cushman and Wakefield that would really assist with that process in terms of that transparency and the outcome. So just back to the wider governance element, phase 1 is approved by the City Council's executive for disposal of land, and it also included some freehold disposal which are considered on a case-by-case basis, reflecting the 999-year standard lease requirement relating to Homes England funding for shared ownership homes. So hopefully that makes sense to most people. So just moving on to the funding element, very, very early engagement with Homes England, as we do with most of our projects, has been incredibly valuable to address issues around viability and wider support actually around expertise as well. So the programme, like many of you out there who are in this area of work, it was subjected to additional viability pressures, including high construction costs, inflation, labour and material shortages as a result of COVID-19. So that cocktail of funding, which we currently rely on, was really necessary to unlock the sites. And Jess will explain a little bit more about that in her next slide. So a couple of more points from me. We're nearly there, hang on. So just with regards to planning, so submission and approval, again, working really closely with our partners is very, very important. Our planners were, key stakeholders when we set about the site identification stage, understanding what the constraints are, what their history is, gathering as much intelligence and information to assist our partners to, consider what would be required in terms of that overall proposal that formed part of the planning application. So I think the key points on this particular point are, engage with planners early, facilitate pre-app meetings where possible. Here at Manchester, we have over 7,000, a workforce of 7,000. So just navigating the different departments, the different members of staff can be difficult for an RP. So we do everything we can within our team to facilitate those conversations, not only with planners, but also highways and neighbourhoods, to ensure the planning submission and approval process is as smooth as possible and there are no surprises for anyone. So I suppose one thing that shouldn't be underestimated at all, and again, we're very lucky at Manchester because we are a big authority, is the level of resourcing that's being required. So, we have our project team here. We have been, very significantly supported by our colleagues in development who look at the land element of it in terms of the contract and the disposal and the technicalities around it. I've mentioned our planning colleagues and, our legal colleagues. They've been absolutely phenomenal. They've resourced us very, very well. And, we've been up against it at times, especially with drawdown of funding deadlines where we have to get things over the line very quickly. And we've had a very good internal team set up to be able to consider all of those very different elements to get things on site and started. So just in terms of phase 2, what we're looking at in terms of the planning process. So since all of that, we've had the introduction of biodiversity net gain uplift requirements. So, these conversations are live and, we're looking at solutions and options to address, how we deliver that on such small, constrained sites, delivering quite, minimum number of homes. So it'll be interesting to see where we get to with that over the next few months. The final point around the planning element is we do try and take some of our projects through to planning committee just for that scrutiny, and then also raise the profile also of the projects as well. So I suppose that takes us on very nicely to starting on site and practical completion. So this is always a very exciting time. Once we've got through the planning process, we've got that seal of approval and site starting on site. So yeah, I suppose the registered providers do notify us when they're starting on site, so we can inform local councillors, inform our MCC neighbourhood colleagues as well, and just consider any wider funding requirements if drawdown is being worked towards. So there are currently 10 schemes on site, so that's 136 home, and then a further 10 schemes are forecasted to start on site by the end of this financial year. So I'll now hand you over to Jess, who will run you through our overall performance to date, just to demonstrate that deliverability.
Yeah, we could just have the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So, as Regina's just said, at present, the first phase of Project 500 is set to bring forward 357 new homes across 22 sites. And at present, 10 sites are under construction, which is 136 homes, and 20 schemes have had their planning approved, which is 258 homes. We've had a further scheme submitted for planning at 70 homes, with the final scheme in the pre-app discussions at 29 homes. 47.3% of the homes will be Manchester Living Rent, followed by 44.8% social rent. And affordable home ownership products will account for 8% of the new homes built, which is shared ownership and rent to buy. And 45% of the new homes built will be larger family homes at 3+ beds, which is a total of 162 larger family homes in phase 1. This could not have been achieved without the support of Homes England and GMCA, Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Homes England have supported 11 schemes to date, delivering a total of 154 units and worth £10.3 million in grants. And to date, GMCA's Brownfield and Brownfield Land Release Fund have supported 21 schemes to a total of £5.96 million. Project 500's low carbon and accessibility credentials increase with every update and programme board with our partners. At present, we've got the following figures confirmed, but this will grow as more sites enter that delivery phase and start on site. So Project 500 will deliver 16 dementia specialist units through Irwell Valley's Derby Avenue. This shows that Project 500 process can support supported housing in addition to the mainstream affordable homes. There's been 19 independent living and age-friendly principal units confirmed, 9 M42 wheelchair accessible units and 2 M43 wheelchair accessible units, 229 new heat pumps, 152 EV charging points, 75 solar thermal PV panels, 30 additional trees and 30 units at EPC A, with then 106 units at EPC B. The social value information for each site is being collated after 3 social value workshops were attended by RPs and ourselves at Manchester City Council, and 14 KPIs were agreed. The RP's perspective of Project 500 is now going to be discussed by Natalie Weatherhill at Jigsaw Homes.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, I work for Jigsaw Homes Group as a development manager. So we're an RP, we work with local authorities in the North West and the East Midlands. Last year we completed 929 affordable homes, but we've worked closely with Manchester City Council for a number of years and are part of the Manchester Housing Providers Partnership, as well as being one of the registered providers delivering under the Project 500 Phase 1. So the units that Jigsaw are delivering span 3 different infill sites. These were identified early on by Manchester City Council, and they're all within around 2 miles of each other, the ones that Jigsaw are delivering, so really close together. The smallest site that we are delivering is a scheme of 4 units, with the largest one being 9. So they are very small and constrained sites within the city. And a key example that you can see here is Lathbury Road. So this is one of our sort of success stories that we wanted to show with Manchester City Council, and we're currently on site with an SME contractor to deliver 6 affordable rent units, so they will be capped at the Manchester Living Rent. And this is a mix of 2 and 3 bed homes. And we've actually procured the same contractor and consultant team across the 3 sites just to really try and maximise efficiency and reduce those costs where possible. The residential policy guidance in Manchester, along with the ambitious principles set at the start of Project 500 around sustainability, mean we're delivering the homes not only to Manchester space standards, which are larger than compliance with NDSS, But this scheme was a really great opportunity for Jigsaw to provide our first ever scheme of net zero carbon homes. So they will be achieving an EPC A and ultimately reducing bills for the end user. In terms of acquisition of the land, so once all those standardised documents were agreed, as Regina said, that did take quite a while, but once we got to that point, the discussions to finalise the documents and slot in that site-specific information made the process really quite straightforward for us and sort of removed any uncertainty around the negotiation, as we knew the expectation of the council at that point. In terms of the planning process for this site, after we'd conducted all our surveys and submitted the information to the council, the planning process took 4 months to obtain full planning permission, which was great. We had really good communication. We had a key point of contact throughout. So ourselves and the architect, really good communication. Any sort of amendments that were required or any consultee responses that came through, we were dealt with really promptly, and we were able to get that approval within the 4 months, which was excellent for us. Lathbury Road benefits from multiple streams of funding. Again, that's super critical for us. So from Homes England via the Affordable Homes Programme and through the Greater Manchester Combined Authorities Brownfield Housing Fund, and other RPs have benefited from the Brownfield Land Release Fund on these sites as well. And again, they just would not be viable without this funding element. So in addition to delivering the homes under the Project 500 initiative, Jigsaw have taken the lead on coordination of social value across the 22 sites for the 7 RP partners, and 14 KPIs were agreed at the start of the project, and these continue to be reported back to MCC at those quarterly board meetings. So, for example, number of hours of employability support for Manchester and number of hours of staff volunteering in the community. And now we're seeing a number of these schemes are physically on site. We're seeing some really great case studies coming through around digital inclusion work with local community groups, and also apprenticeships that are being created within Manchester, as there is an obligation on the contractors based on the value of the works to commit social value hours. So this is really great for young people locally, and in some cases we're already seeing how apprentices can see a really wide range of different sites, but they're still very geographically close, which is fantastic. And these KPIs are just a great way of ensuring we're maximising the social impact we can have collaboratively across Manchester, and we're really looking forward to seeing our widespread impact when most schemes complete by March 26 in the phase 1. Thank you. Back to MCC.
So much, Natalie, for such a glowing review. It's very well appreciated here. So you'll be glad to know this is the last slide now. So I just want to summarise really by saying, when we set out on this journey in terms of what are we going to do with our infill sites and how can we look at our strategic objectives to deliver more affordable housing, we certainly didn't have all the answers right at the beginning, but we have learned so much during this whole journey, and it's really allowed us to refine the approach to phase 2, which will take that number to over 500 homes, and is currently being marketed to MHPP partners. So I can't really talk too much about that, but I can certainly go through what the key changes have been from our learning to date. So the first one is obtaining an independent opinion on value in terms of that, best value and those considerations. And that's something Cushman & Wakefield have assisted us with here in Manchester. I've also mentioned the SAMP approval process to formalise strategic fit, and again, those value assumptions. We're looking at one partner to deliver a portfolio of sites across the city for phase 2, because I think our MHPP partners are now more open to, looking at the opportunities across the city that may be beyond their more traditional zones. We're also engaged with GMCA in terms of that Brownfield Housing Fund Year 3 allocation. So we have over £1 million already allocated, subject to meeting those funding timescales for phase 2. So that allows our partner to build that into their financial modelling when looking at such constrained and challenging infill sites. No surprises. The legal suite of documents is ready to go, so we won't have to really make any, significant changes to those. This was a very innovative approach at its time, and we continue with that theme of innovation. And we're working with Onward Housing on one of the sites, which is already allocated due to that adjacent land holding on an modern methods of construction scheme as well. So it'll be very interesting to see that go through the process and just monitor those timescales for delivery. One thing we will need to consider is have a look at our red lines to allow maybe a biodiversity and net gain uplift and that future kind of maintenance liability, or does that play out as a planning condition for when the BNG banks are ready? So again, we're working very closely with our planners to look at those options, and obviously our preference is always for that on-site uplift in the first instance. And something we're really, really proud of is that we're asking our partners on all of our land disposals on small and medium sites to consider 20% of the homes to be accessible, so at M43. So our Places for Everyone plan is, thinking along the same lines, but maybe looking at an M42 standard. So this really takes it to that next level, and we know that's where our need is, as the DFG budget for disability funding grants is reduced or changed in terms of eligibility. So to conclude, the overall approach has been really well received, and there is a recognition, about the level of resourcing that's required to deliver such small schemes. The process has allowed us to develop a further programme with MHPP, which is in its infancy, and we'll probably need to work on the branding a little. It's called MHPP Disposals at the moment. It's early days, the principles are very similar to what we're doing here, and we're able to progress more medium-sized sites, so that's 25 units or more for disposal, to MHPP for affordable housing. So I started this session by just saying, this is one of the options available to us here at Manchester as part of a wider toolkit that not only looks at small infill sites, we're also looking at, medium-sized sites, looking at our regeneration areas, and we're also looking at district centres as well. So we're really confident that we're going to meet our overall target set out in the housing strategy. And I'd just like to take the opportunity just to thank Jess today, and I'd like to thank Natalie and Steve Sheen and the team for kind of all the support to get us to this point today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. For this, and so I'm Richard Kennedy from Cornerstone Place. If you click onto the next slide, we're going to talk a bit about who we are and what we talk about as Impact First Social Housing, think through some of the delivery models and ownership models that we've worked with and the pros and cons of those different models, talk about some examples. We've been working quite deeply with Rochdale, so I'll talk through some of that and then close on some challenges and mitigations. Next slide, please. So we are Cornerstone Place. We transform unused land and buildings into affordable homes for local authorities, RPs and charities, building 100% social housing, but without profit. And a critical part of our philosophy, if you want to call it that, is we believe the assets should be in the hands of the impact makers, and local authorities and asset-locked registered providers and charities are what we would say are impact makers. And what that does is it ensures that any returns, the revenue returns and the capital returns, are then locked into that community for the long term to serve and maximise impact for that community. We've delivered nearly 20,000 what we call impact bed nights, and we have about 8 million under contract at the moment at various stages of development. We also have a pipeline, in addition to that, of about 50 different sites with local authorities, RPs and charities across England, which represents about another 500 homes. Next slide, please. We're a certified social enterprise, and we've won some awards recently. We're also members of Homeless Link and CIH, where I've just become or been appointed as co-chair of their newly formed homelessness policy subgroup. We're also registered on the Crown Commercial Services as a supplier, and we're also People and Planet verified. Next slide, please. So what is impact first social housing, as Anna explained earlier, that there is a chronic shortage of homes in England at the moment, with council waiting lists at the highest level they've been since 2014, and 2.2 billion a year spent on temporary accommodation for over 117,000 households, including tragically for 150,000 children. And I know I don't need to labour that point with this audience. So we call what we do is impact first social housing. It's social housing reinvented. It's development of council assets exclusively for social housing. It's always in partnership with local authorities, and working with them and the local RPs and charitable sector to meet the needs of the local people. We're often developing on local authority land or buildings, including a CPO we're working on at the moment. And ultimately, we get to the point where hopefully Homes England or MHCLG provide an element of grant funding. The balance is funded by debt, and that debt should be fundable through local housing allowance at worst, and hopefully social rent. A few of the things that we make sure through our model and our approach is that there's no equity leakage to the private sector. So those are locked into public bodies and charities and RPs. We're needs and impact driven. We believe it's a solution through small sites that's a solution for the whole social housing challenge. We do work with small sites and large sites. We deliver at cost with no developer profit, with 100% transparency all the way through. And all of our new builds are net zero, and we include building management systems to monitor things like humidity and noxious gases and energy usage to ensure that we can optimize the best possible environment for the people that live in those homes. Next slide, please. Is that coming up? Next slide. Thank you very much. So we've worked on a number of different models and different kind of ownership models and delivery models. So the first one is where obviously the local authority owns and operates the site, and this could be leased potentially to a local provider or charity on a short 5 to 10 year lease, but with all of the ownership retained by the local authority. Then there's a sort of space in the middle where the local authority might have retain the freehold, but with a very long lease to a provider or a local charity. And this could be 125 years plus to ensure that if you're using Homes England capital, it will be deployed for social housing for that 125-year period. And often you would then need a nominations agreement in place between the local authority and the RP to ensure that the local authority can put people in those homes. And then finally, on the right-hand side, where you've got a registered provider or charity-led ownership model, the freehold then could originate from the charity or the local authority, could even be a market purchase or a freehold site that's transferred from the local authority. And again, obviously, a nominations agreement helps to ensure that the viability from a financial perspective. So on the left-hand side, in the kind of crossover bit on the Venn, you've got a local authority freehold where that's retained by the local authority, and then on the right hand side, that the bit in the middle of those circles is where it's more RP or charity long-term interest. There are things to consider which are important, which are, is the local authority itself able to raise capital? If it's not, you might want to consider some of these other approaches. If there is hopefully a local RP or charity that's able to raise the capital, again, that's another thing that can work into this to help you decide which is the best model. And if you're working with a charity that's not an RP, then you may require an RP to be involved as well to ensure that you can meet all of the standards and also reclaim from TWP. And also linking back to Anna's presentation earlier, it's really important as you're considering which model might work best for you to have robust and transparent governance structures in place. And do you need and do you have the dedicated resources to execute this yourselves? And if not, then I think we've had lots of discussion today about possible partnership models. And then also just recognizing the value of collaboration. And for us, the best projects are the ones where they are true collaborations with all of the different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a scheme that we delivered during COVID in Audenshaw. It's a project that's owned by a charity. We delivered 13 self-contained apartments. We worked with a designer to follow the principles of psychologically informed environments and to maximise the well-being for the residents that live in these units. And this will be fully owned by a local charity. Next slide, please. This was a true partnership with GMCA, ourselves, Stepping Stone Projects, who are a local charity, Tameside local authority, and also Ashton Pioneer Homes. And while she was in opposition, Angela Rayner opened this project, and Andy Burnham visited the site and spent time talking to the residents that live there. Next slide, please. So this is an example where a local authority has retained the freehold, but what we've done in partnership with a local charity is sign a 125-year lease, which enabled us to raise the capital to bring this, what was a very dilapidated building that no one else wanted to touch, back into impactful use. And it was, again, a partnership between ourselves, the local authority, and a local homelessness support charity and registered provider. And this now forms part of a vital pathway between street homelessness and long-term move-on accommodation in Fenland. Next slide, please. So our next few examples are highlighting a strategic partnership we've got with Rochdale Borough Council, delivering homes in a variety of different ways. And we developed a model for our first site, Whitworth Road, which I'll go on to in a moment. And we currently have 34 net zero homes in construction, 8 that are going to be a kind of refurb. We've got 50 odd in planning, and about 170 sites that the council have identified, and hopefully we can help them to deliver some of those as well. Next slide, please. So I think most towns and cities have forgotten sites that look a bit like these ones here. If you click onto the next slide as a street view, there are loads of these all over the place, and a bit like what Jess was saying earlier, these sites were previously used for fly tipping, and this was a cost for the council, and it's costing the money to maintain those sites. If you click onto the next slide, please. We now have a 125-year lease on these 3 sites, and we're developing these into 14 net zero homes. Once it's complete, we're going to sell these properties to the local charity, but at cost, at just the cost of the debt, and they will take over the liabilities through the grant funding. And we received nearly £1 million in Rough Sleeper Accommodation Programme funding, 141,000 in Towns Fund, and 271,000 in Brown Land Release Fund. And then we raised the rest through social investment, and then this social investment will be repaid in the sale to the charity at the end. This is a pretty complex project to unlock, and we work with the council to uncover the best value considerations and make sure we were maximising the social value on the site. There are 3 units for people with reduced mobility and an office for the charity. The whole design and makeup of this project was co-produced with the council and the charity to try and maximise the operational effectiveness and the well-being of the residents. And this is a project that won us an award last year for Social Investment Deal of the Year, and is also currently being exhibited at the Building Centre exhibition in London as a case study until February 2025. Next slide, please. These are some recent photos from the site. So we're out of the ground now. The solar panels on the roof, as explained, they'll be net zero, so they will contribute more electricity to the grid than they use when the sun's not shining, and very highly insulated units with mechanical ventilation to ensure that we've got high quality air within, but also not losing any energy out. Next slide, please. So we've now started on 3 new projects with Rochdale through the SHAP programme. We've now got JCT signed on all 3 of these projects, and works are underway on the new builds. These sites will be retained by Rochdale Borough Council with short operational leases with the homelessness support RP that works locally. And our assistance started really from the initial concept of trying to find sites, working with them to submit the SHAP funding in collaboration with the local charitable sector, and then ultimately now we're delivering those through to handing the keys over at the end. Next slide, please. Final example from Rochdale. Rochdale presented this site to us and asked us what we could do with it, and we flipped it back to them and said, well, tell us where your greatest area of need is. And they told us that if you have a family that has a disabled someone that's in a wheelchair that's part of that family unit, then they're going to be in temporary accommodation, for 10 years, or essentially until that family, the children have grown up. And so we said, well, that's absolutely what we need to do then. So It's now in pre-app. We're waiting for a response from the local authority on it, and this will be a mix of 1 bed, 2 person bungalow through to a 6 bed, 8 person double house. There will be net zero. We're going to try and get to 0 bills with this one, with small batteries on each of the units. It's low density to kind of suit the location, and it includes covered parking because I know it's been snowing in Manchester today, but it does rain occasionally in Rochdale. And we want to make sure that there's covered parking so that people can drive in and get through from their cars into the house without having to be outside. And yeah, like I said, currently in pre-app and hoping to take this one forward soon. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges and mitigations that we've come across through the way we work with different local authorities, charities, and registered providers. There's a lot of at-risk costs that are required up front, and that sometimes it can then be £10,000 or £20,000. Sometimes it can be £200,000 or £300,000, depending on the size of the development. It's important to understand who funds that, where the risk sits, and often we work with local authorities to try and to fund those costs, especially if they're going to own the assets at the end. As discussed earlier, there's you want to make sure that the local authority is able to recover all of the housing benefits, and so making sure that there's an RP involved is also important to think about that right at the start. Then during the development phase, who's taking the risk, and I'm not sure where that sits with the MCC sites, but if it's with the developer, then they need to be that needs to be clear with them. If it's with the local authority, then you need to make sure that you're putting in enough contingency to cover any development risks. And then I think there's been a few questions in the chat about procurement. There are various different compliant procurement routes. So with Rochdale initially, particularly on the SHAP programme, we were working with them through the sort of emergency provisions that they had in place because they were failing on their statutory obligations. But then there's also direct awards and obviously a full procurement process. I think in terms of mitigations and solutions, co-production is absolutely the way to go. So engaging with your local housing providers, your local contractors, your local QSs, all of those things, I think you're going to get the best result for your local community. And then also the risk, challenge and opportunity, I guess, around local community buy-in and NIMBYism. I think if we're developing small sites, that's a little bit easier than building huge developments where there's going to be a little bit more pushback. But I think there's also an opportunity to engage with local communities to explain the benefit of the housing and how that housing will be for those local people, and be supporting them and their families and their friends who otherwise might be in housing need. I think that's it. Yeah, maybe the next slide. Thank you very much. There's a QR code there. Feel free to scan it and get in touch if you want to find out more about what we do, and we're very happy to have conversations with people and work through challenges you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to all the presenters. We're now going to go into a Q&A session. So if you don't mind, can all the presenters just come back on to screen, please, with your camera on? Just give you a couple of minutes just to all come back on. While the presenters are coming back on, can you just apologise for the technical difficulties some of you experienced at the beginning, including myself? So apologies for that. It's always going to happen when we've got so many people on the chat and accessing the information today. So we're just going to run through the chat. Was really active through all of the presentations, which was great. So we've just got a number of questions that myself and Zahida are going to sort of pitch to the panel, if that's okay. Just something that Richard's just started to cover. Do the panel have any tips on how to smooth out the procurement process, including accessing important contractors from frameworks, etc.? Reg, Jess, do you want to start this one off?
Hi, Steve, of course, yes. So here in Manchester, our registered housing providers have options around what, framework they may want to access. So I won't kind of mention any specifically, but I'm sure we can follow it up maybe after the meeting. So that process, as you'll all be familiar with, has varying lots depending on the value of the scheme, and you can make appointments, for professional services and building services through that manner. And some of the RPs also have an in-house opportunity as well. And I think it's just worth adding, I was going to pick up one of the other questions, but in terms of what we're doing on Project 500, it's not necessarily a procurement exercise, it's ultimately a land deal with a development agreement. So whilst we apply good practice from the procurement process, we're not kind of legally bound by that apart from the best value consideration. So that kind of changes the landscape slightly in terms of how we kind of engage, and providing transparency and a very clear process to all partners who are participating is really key, regardless of it being kind of a procurement or a land deal, would be my kind of key takeaway on that element.
Okie doke. Reg, just while we're on it then, there's just a question came up early on around nomination agreements, and were these part of your standardised legal suite
They
documents?
were, yes. Yeah, so we have a collaboration agreement with Manchester Housing Provider Partnership, which covers a whole suite of things that formalises our relationship, and the nominations agreement are part of that documentation. So we've not had to develop that. We've not had to start from scratch. We've used what's in that document, and it gives different partners different rights. So we didn't want to complicate that even further. So that stands as it is.
And just finally on that bit then, is there anything that you could share, or are you willing to discuss with partners on the call around the standardised documents that you may be willing to sort of talk them through what you produced?
Yeah, it's probably a conversation we need to kind of maybe, pick up outside of this, but there's definitely opportunities to look at some themes and good practice. But I'd always caveat that with, you need to speak to your own legal teams and your own procurement teams. I'm not here to give that level of advice. But I think nationally, Steve, it could be something we look at together to, bring forward the sites that we've described and that criteria, which is really challenging.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea, Reg. I think that's something we could put some support behind. Just before I go to Sahida for a question that's specifically for Homes England, just wanted to cover someone asked early on, Anna, if the ARIT report was available publicly. And I know you've offered to share like a one-pager which summarises that, because it was a specific document that was commissioned for Sheffield City Council, wasn't it?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think because it's probably in the ownership of Sheffield City Council and Homes England, I guess it's probably not up to me to share that document, but we can take that away and see if there's something a concise summary that we can share.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And Sahida, one of the questions came up about, can we discuss grant levels nationally, please? And in particular, if additional funding weight can be awarded if we are developing net zero carbon homes, which have proven savings for the NHS, people's health, as well as the climate. Sorry, I think you're on mute, Sahida. No. Sorry. Well, let me jump in there. Just in case Sahida's struggling with the. It is something that we will consider, and we have been considering through the current Affordable Homes Programme, where partners are coming through with various schemes where they're just going to push that sustainability envelope. It is something that we definitely discuss. So if you're in conversations as a partner with your growth manager nationally, have a conversation with them around pushing the level of grant to support that additional sustainability amount. And where possible, like say, I think some of the presenters covered this today, where land can be considered as an investment or additional funding can go through, like brownfield funding. I know that's particularly relevant in Greater Manchester, where they work with Homes England to support that sort of gap around sort of financial viability. I'm just going to go on to just one of the questions again, Reg, and Jess. In coming up with the project, did councillors have any aspiration to build these sites out themselves? And if so, how did you manage to convince them to move forward with RPs? Quite challenging.
I suppose it's, it's always important to manage that political kind of ambition. And I suppose our starting point was our housing strategy, which is obviously agreed by, the local politicians. In terms of direct delivery, we have developed our own scheme in Newton Heath in North Manchester, which has been really well received locally. And I suppose through the Project 500 process, we've not had a great demand or requirement from local members to deliver that. I think here in Manchester, the partnership we have with MHPP is recognised and is valued, and we know that we're going to get a really good product and neighbourhood management and wraparound support for some of the most vulnerable tenants in the country as part of that offer. So it's been very well received by local councillors.
There was a question, or a couple of specific questions around the makeup of the Project 500 team. I know it was a combination between Manchester and RP Partners, but it'd be really good to understand, because I know the specific question was around how did you get your property and assets people on board with what you were doing, but there were also questions around were planning colleagues involved early on and various things. Could you just give us a bit of an outline of how the project team was built up and how that worked?
Yep, so it's nobody's full-time job working on Project 500. There's 3 of us from within our strategic housing team who work on it, but it's just part of one of our many projects that we're working on. But obviously we did have to foster that relationship with planning and development and highways legal colleagues early on. But for them as well, it's just one small part of the different projects we're doing. Nobody's on it full time. And I think it just shows the success of us working internally with those colleagues, and also with the strength of an MHPP that it's able to operate without a full-time team on it.
Oh, fantastic. Can you just, in terms of just sort of taking that question on a little bit further, could you just give us a bit of information around how the RP partnership works and how that's supported the delivery of Project 500 and how that's evolved?
Natalie, would you like to come in perhaps from an RP perspective?
Yeah, sure. So the partnership is, a group of stockholding RPs in Manchester, and these opportunities for disposals come sort of directly to the partnership. And I think one of the questions referenced, does the RP then build it out themselves? And that is absolutely the case in terms of Project 500. The approach to the site was sort of, as is with the rest, we're applying for our own funding, getting it through planning ourselves. It's just that initial opportunity, which often is, if we're up against private investors for private sale, often we wouldn't necessarily get a look in. So those opportunities that come directly to us via the partnership are great. And yes, we do build them out ourselves.
Right, fantastic. Just going to sort of touch on a couple of questions for Richard. Do residents have a right to buy, sort of hence potential leakage into the private sector with the work that you've done in the areas that you mentioned, Richard?
So for the smaller units, the below NDSS, it's C2 designation, so there wouldn't be a right to buy. For the larger units that are above NDSS, there's normally a restriction within the within the use of those buildings as being used for people at risk of homelessness rather than general needs accommodation. So we've not seen that as a risk just yet, but on some bigger schemes there have been those have been discussed, although we haven't that risk hasn't materialised yet. But I believe, let's see what happens. That there may well be a change in government policy around that to ensure that we maintain the amount of social stock in the sort of broader context.
And I've got a very specific one for you, Richard. Have you done any community work with local church groups who want to deliver a residential scheme but still keep the religious aspect? No, that's quite specific.
Yeah, that's fine. Actually, I had a discussion with one this morning. So we haven't actually delivered any work yet, but often churches, whether it be Church of England or the Catholic Church or the Baptist Church, we've talked to all three. They do have significant assets in brilliant locations, often town centre locations. We're looking at one up north at the moment, quite detailed discussions with the local authority and the Church of England about bringing back into use an asset which is effectively completely disused and abandoned. So yeah, of course, there's a great opportunity because these are fantastic sites in brilliant locations, and if the church, whichever church it is, whichever denomination wants to retain that use, that for building a community, I think that's great because it provides important homes for people, but also helps to build a community. And if that works with the needs of the church, and it should do, because churches are about community and about supporting people, and then absolutely, yeah. So very happy to have discussions with people about that.
Brilliant. And I'm just gonna go back to Anna. Anna, I know that since the work in Sheffield, you're doing some work with other local authorities and combined authorities. So is there anything specific that you'd like to mention around the direction of travel that this work's taking?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so we're in the midst of another piece of work, which is having a look at the ways in which there is some consistency in some areas, lack of consistency around disposals of land to third parties, specifically with RPs. So again, it's taken this work to another step forward in terms of trying to understand the best practice and share those examples, because I think some of the feedback that we've had so far is that there is kind of no need sometimes to reinvent the wheel, and there is actually really good practice elsewhere, but it's just understanding that information being shared amongst local authorities, because I think people are generally very busy. So if we can make it easier by finding that out and doing that work and then sharing it amongst partners and local authorities, then we are trying to do that. So watch this space.
I think that's a really important point, and I know it's one of the part of the ethos of the local government capacity centre sessions around sort of sharing information with partners, hence the sessions that are on over the next 2 weeks. So I think that's a really crucial point. I think just one last question to all of the panel. If there's anything, if there's one thing that you'd like to pick out or be specific around the presentation you've given, what sort of recommendation or advice would you give to the attendees? Shall we start with Richard?
Sure, thanks. No, nothing like being on the hotspot. So I would say begin with the end in mind. What is it you're trying to achieve? Where, who are the beneficiaries that you're trying to support? Is it single males? Is it young families? Is it multi-generational families? Start there, and then try and see what to work with your local the local stakeholders, the local RPs and QSs and other people to try and deliver those ambitions.
Brilliant. The Manchester team?
I think it's quite clear from our presentation that infill sites alone don't deliver the big numbers in isolation, and there is a numbers element to what we are doing here. So by collaborating, by going on that journey of partnership working, not only can we deliver affordable homes, we can address neighbourhood management issues, and we can save the public purse some cash as well.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Anna?
Sure. So it's really simple, I think, in terms of probably going back to my last slide, but I think it's getting the fundamentals right. So I think one of the best examples is kind of that plan of what you need where, and communicating that ambition both internally and externally. And I think that's a really good starting point.
Oh, fantastic. I think we're just going to go back to the slide deck in a minute, but I'd just like to thank you for your contribution to the Q&A session and the presentations that you've delivered. Could we just go back to the slide deck, please? Yeah, just want to thank, I think these are some of the key messages. Some of these were picked out just in that sort of final question that we've gone through there, but I'll just leave that with the attendees to have a look through. There's the contact details for the key organisations who have been part of the presentation and some links to the sort of wider learning. Can we go to the next slide, please? I hope everyone's enjoyed this. Again, a big thanks to all of the presenters, and that concludes today's sessions. Thank you for your input throughout the session. Thank you and goodbye.